So getting into the Warhammer 40k tabletop hobby can be a pretty big challenge at the best of times, never mind choosing an army that puts you on extra difficult mode. Today let's talk through 5 of the easiest factions to start Warhammer 40k with. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about getting into Warhammer 40k from a standing start, and some of the armies that are maybe going to give you a bit of an easier ride to do so. If you start in the Warhammer 40k hobby, there's really quite a lot to see, do and learn. While the core game looks like it's going to be slimmed down a bit into 10th edition, there's still a lot of rules to learn, plus anything that's relevant for your faction. There's the financial cost of buying and acquiring the models, which might not be the easiest, with the prices that Games Workshop charge, plus all the mysteries and challenges of putting together your first miniatures and getting some paint on them, and making them look right for your force on the tabletop. It does seem that Games Workshop is trying to gear things in 10th edition to make things a lot better for new players like that. Freely downloadable rules for a start, many things simplified and streamlined, and in general trying to just reduce the barriers to entry just a bit. I think that currently with a new edition looming, it's really quite a good time to be getting into the hobby, though I would say that choosing armies and factions, things aren't always all that even, and I feel like some armies are just going to give newer players a bit of a rougher time to try and get going with, at least compared with others. In general, the advice for picking your army in Warhammer 40k does tend to be to go for the army that you like the look, lore and rules for, probably skewing a bit more towards the first two, as rules do tend to change over time. If you're painting and playing with something that you like, you're going to be a lot more motivated to do things with it than if you pick a faction where you hate the look of the models. Still though, I think that quite a lot of people out there are kind of flexible. They could be happy putting some big armoured space marines together, or some twisted mutated genestealer cultists, and sometimes I feel like for newer players it might well be worth considering the other things that make an army easy to collect, things like the price and the cost of acquiring the models, the typical gameplay of the faction, and whether or not it's usually going to be easy to master for people who are learning the rules. Typically armies that are a bit tougher and can handle themselves at range and in melee tend to be a bit more forgiving. It tends to be hard to go too far wrong with that. And also there's the modelling requirements as well. Generally you'll find it easier to get a force on the table and actually get some games in if you've got fewer models to paint up, and even for armies that might have a similar sort of number of models, some are just a lot more detailed and tricky to paint and take a long time as opposed to others. With those things in particular in mind, I thought we'd just go through 5 factions which I feel are fairly decent starter factions for 40k. Certainly not the only ones that you could jump in with, and a lot of the rest have their positives and negatives, but I'd argue that these ones are pretty decent examples right now. First up, and perhaps a famously easy faction to get into 40k with, are the Golden Guardians of Terror, the Adeptus Custodes. These guys are basically super elite space marines, superhuman above the normal Astartes, each one kind of equivalent with a hero or character of other factions maybe, and as you can expect they get some of the best arms and armour possible, often making war, with elite infantry formations with heavy use of their auric guardian spears. Their current miniature range is kind of a small one as 40k armies go, only a few infantry kits, some bikes and some characters right now, plus a few more generic space marine units like some dreadnoughts and a land raider. Most of their unique models really are quite fancy with a fair bit of detail, but in general it doesn't tend to be the amount of detail that you usually have to pick out individually. Most of them tend to be gold or some other metallic colour if you want to shake things up a bit, so maybe aren't the hardest to paint. Price-wise, they're certainly one of the very cheapest armies to play in Warhammer 40k. Often an important number that you could look at is the points per dollar, how many points on the board you'd get for X amount of money spent. When you look at this for Custodes, they generally tend to be absolutely excellent, particularly on their standard Custodian guards and their Virtus Praetor jet bikes, and that's kind of doubled down on with their excellent Combat Patrol box set, where you get a fair few of their important kits. You may also be able to snag copies of the recent Boarding Patrol box set that they had, plus their Christmas Battle Force. Both of those are very nice ones to pair with the Combat Patrol box set if you could find them on eBay or a third-party shop or something. Generally a Custodes army is going to cost you a lot less than many other factions in 40k. For getting models on the table, they are a very elite army that you don't need all that many forces for. A typical army could be around 20 or 30 models, or even less if you go a little bit dreadnought heavy, and they can be very simple to paint if desired. Literally just spray gold, hit them with a bit of a wash and a bit of a dry brush to highlight up some shiny edges, fill in some details, and you're good to go. Gameplay wise, things are likely to be changing somewhat with 10th edition shortly, but in general Custodes tend to be at least fairly predictable and well rounded. Big chunky people who can tank a whole load of enemy fire, advancing towards the enemy and putting them down with some elite melee attacks. Whenever Custodes get strong, they tend to be a force that dominates the midboard, and the profiles of their weapons generally tend to be pretty good against standard Space Marines, which is kind of helpful as they're quite a regular force to see in the meta. For drawbacks for collecting them, that small model range maybe is one of them. There's kind of two different levels you could collect Custodes at, either just going off their core plastic range or buying some fancy resin things from Forge World. These are quite expensive if you wanted some non-3D printed Caladius tanks or Telemann dreadnoughts and things. The models are generally considered to be quite nice, but Forge World is very pricey. If you're on a budget, it would probably be worth sticking to the Games Workshop plastic kits. I have seen a few people use some 3D printed stand-in ones for some bigger models. I think starting out at the moment you could do worse than picking up the Combat Patrol box for Adeptus Custodes. That does seem pretty excellent, to be honest. Or maybe just a box of the regular Custodian Guard if you wanted to dip your toe in. They're quite fun as they also build things like the Vexilla and on-foot shield captains. Moving on to our next offering, and next we have Necrons, 40k's favourite race of ancient robot skeletons, an ancient deathless Xenos civilization that made a rather unfortunate patch with their star god deities swapping their flesh for metal at the small price of all of their souls. Now arising from their tomb worlds once more, they find the galaxy populated with upstart races. Their pharaons and nobles are set to try and reclaim their empire from the stars. Models wise, Necrons have had a pretty good time of it recently. A pretty enormous massive range refresh towards the start of 9th edition, loads of nice new sculpts and updated ones for classic miniatures, and they've got far more extensive unit options than they had before, really quite good options for just about every battlefield role now. Price wise, in general it's going to be a bit easier to acquire Necron models than quite a lot of other factions in Warhammer 40k right now, as they've basically been the antagonist faction of 40k 9th edition. They've tended to have a whole load of discount sets and repeated offerings to get their models a bit cheaper than you would normally. Perhaps most notably the starter sets, things like the 40k Recruit and Elite editions, which will probably be going out of print in the nearish future, but it generally means that second-hand supply of Necron models tends to be rather excellent. You can find quite a lot on eBay, either through those things, one-off discount bundles, or potentially people who have picked up the Imperium magazine. Things like Necron Warriors and Scorpec Destroyers shouldn't be too hard to get a hold of. Again, like the Adeptus Custodes, if you want to get models on the table very quickly, Necrons as a rather silvery army of space robots can be very quick to paint up if you want to. Again, you can pretty much spray a coat of silver on, wash them all in known oil. You'll have a nice simple but effective result over the vast majority of the model there, and then you can add detail to taste, maybe some nice glowing green bits, and shade in some panels in black and other colours. Again, you can definitely be more fancy than you want, but it's nice to have the quick and easy option for those who want it. Gameplay-wise, the Necrons do have durability and resilience as perhaps one of their army's key features that they tend to play around. Reanimation protocols and living metal making them a little bit harder to take down than most. We've recently had the 10th edition version of reanimation protocol shown off, your army basically healing wounds over the course of the game. Quite a nice easy passive faction mechanic, that one. Anything that your opponent can't quite kill will gradually heal itself. Otherwise, they're a fairly typical 40k army, maybe a bit more of a focus on fairly close range shooting and combat than some perhaps now. A lot of their units aren't spectacularly fast, often tending to advance in an implacable phalanx, commanded by their nobles and cryptex. In terms of drawbacks to getting into them at the moment, they will have a bunch of discount deals removed for 10th edition I suspect. The 40k starter sets will probably be replaced by some Space Marines vs Tyranids ones, might just mean that a few of their deals aren't quite as good deals into the future. Still though, I think they still fit the box pretty well as a decent starter faction. They've had a lot of focus and emphasis on them recently. They'll have their codex fairly early in 10th edition as well, with probably some new models coming then. If I were to start the faction, I'd be tempted by the Combat Patrol box, that's fine enough. Or perhaps the Recruit or Elite edition of 40k starter sets. Currently the Recruit edition is definitely the way to buy Necron Warriors, as it basically costs the same cost as their box set, but gets you some extra bits. Just quickly as an aside while we're on the subject of picking up 40k models, I'd bear in mind that there's plenty of places around the world that do things cheaper than Games Workshop do. They don't tend to offer big discounts, but plenty of independent retailers can. If you're in the UK, you could consider buying through Element Games, usually 15% off most Warhammer products. They're based in the UK, and Noble Knight Games in the USA is usually around about 8 to 10% off a lot of Games Workshop things. Both of those stores will be linked down in the video description. Any sales made through them do help support the channel, as well as potentially saving you a bit of money compared with direct from GW. Warhammer can certainly be pretty expensive. I do tend to try and buy through local gaming stores and things myself when I pick things up, as it does add up to quite a bit in the long term. Moving on though, I think it would be remiss to have a Start 40k faction guide without the Space Marines being mentioned. As I'm sure if you've heard just about anything about 40k, Space Marines are the genetically augmented super soldiers in power armor. They fight in nightly chapters, all of which have their own personality, themes, strengths and weaknesses, and make war with the holy bolt gun and chainsword, and plenty of other war machines besides. Their miniature range is the single biggest range out of any army in Warhammer 40k, to the extent where they've got multiple really heavily developed sub-factions like Blood Angels and Dark Angels, and just a ridiculous amount of core unit offerings that cover just about every battlefield role. They generally tend to be pretty elite, but beyond that there's almost every playstyle available to you. Pricing wise, generally Space Marines throughout 40k's history have usually been a pretty easy army to start the game with, perhaps partly kept deliberately so by Games Workshop. They've been in just about every 40k starter box set, which generally tend to be pretty decent discounts on the miniatures within. The new Leviathan box looks pretty interesting for them in 10th edition, and currently they have no less than 5 Combat Patrol box sets, all of which offer Primaris miniatures, some of them with some upgrade sprues as well, but you can use them for any chapter. There's the Phobos one as the standard Space Marine Combat Patrol, though I do quite like both the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels one. I feel like they both have some nice unit mixes, and barring the upgrade sprues, there's nothing in the box sets that can't be used by other chapters. Besides that, even quite a lot of their regular box sets give you a decent enough amount of points for the money invested, particularly things like their 10-man box sets, things like Intercessors, Assault Intercessors, or Hellblasters perhaps. For getting models on the table, the vast majority of Space Marine miniatures tend to be at least relatively straightforward to put together, a little bit less fiddly than some more recent 40k releases. Painting's not really too difficult either, lots of blocky armour that you can paint in and shade quite quickly. How fast they can actually get them on the table might depend a bit on whether or not you're going for things like edge highlighting and shading, but for the most part I'd say that a bunch of flat colour maybe isn't the hardest to paint compared with some. Again, being an army that's perhaps a little bit more elite than most means that they're fairly easy to get the miniatures on the table. You don't have to be painting up hundreds of Horde models. Gameplay wise, I'd generally say that the theme of Space Marines tend to be that they're fairly forgiving. Power armor means that even if your unit's mispositioned, it can still potentially survive out in the open, and perhaps more than a fair few armies in 40k, they tend to be almost equally happy in range and melee. Plenty of units can do either depending on their battlefield role. Again, can be handy if you're just roughly throwing the models into position and against the enemy army. Having such a wide variety of models could maybe be a bit overwhelming, but at least it means that whatever your playstyle is, Space Marines should be able to reflect it somewhat. Whether you prefer gun lining and obliterating the opponent with ranged weapons, fast-moving biker forces, or indomitable tough stuff with things like Terminators with storm shields. In terms of drawbacks of collecting Space Marines, maybe the big range can just be a little bit overwhelming sometimes. Games Workshop does seem to like cycling around what's good and what's bad these days, so often it might mean that a completely different unit that you don't have might be suddenly one of the best things for them. It's a bit harder to collect something of everything than, say, an army with fewer choices like Custodes or Thousand Suns or something. I'd bear in mind as well that the long-term future of certain Space Marine models might be in a little bit of doubt. Looks like they are going to be gradually phasing out and replacing certain Firstborn miniatures, either directly replacing with Primaris or potentially just retiring. This will probably happen over a very long extended time. They're not going to have a mass cull anytime soon, but if it were me I'd probably be tempted to skew a bit towards the newer Primaris models when I was collecting a force, just for fear of having certain miniatures invalidated. If I were starting Space Marines myself, I think it would vary quite a bit depending on what flavour of them I'd want to play. Just for something general purpose and fairly flexible though, I'd think about something like the Combat Patrol Dark Angels or Blood Angels boxes right now, not necessarily using the upgrade sprues or anything, but just the miniatures. Or maybe just a basic box of infantry, like Intercessors perhaps, or even one of the starter boxes, whether it's 9th or 10th. Moving on, if you did want to start a Warhammer 40k force of a rather different nature, you could think about either Imperial or Chaos Knights. This is basically kind of playing 40k on a different scale, an entire army of great big knightly nobles, either in service of the Imperium or the Mechanicus and fighting against the traitors and heretics, or forsworn traitors or renegade households making war with demon-infused weaponry and fell bonds. The miniature range for both of these is kind of small at the moment. They are pretty recent 40k factions. Mostly speaking, it's either Questores or Abhorrent class knights, the War Dogs or Armigers, and the more shooting flavoured Dominus class, but I'd say that all of these are really quite nice kits to build and assemble. They look pretty striking on the tabletop, and I've seen people do some very fun and fancy things with the modelling and painting on them. Price-wise, all the Imperial Knight kits might be quite expensive, but at least it gets you a massive great big chunk of your army done in one go. I'd say the Armigers and War Dogs coming in their boxes of 2 really aren't too bad for 2 vehicles by current 40k standards. They don't generally tend to have any discounts, not beyond occasional things like that Christmas battle force for the Imperial Knights, which was rather good, but for the most part I'd say that they're probably not the most expensive army to collect in the world. Compared with most, it's not really the hardest to build up a choice of every single model in their codex, particularly if you use some magnets. For getting miniatures on the table, again painting knights I suppose can be a little bit daunting perhaps. They are quite big kits and have at least a fair amount of detail on them, but again it's a bit of a case of big effort and big payoff as you get a big chunk of your army done if you have one finished, and there are certain tricks that you can use to speed things up a bit. A lot of people like to leave off a bunch of their armor plates as they're assembling the knights, then spray the undersuits all silver so you get all the metal parts done, and you can spray those separate armor plates in the colour of the heraldry. That way you've already got a fair amount of the base coat down in two different colours, rather than having to block in either of them individually with a brush. As mentioned, if you can be bothered to do magnets as you're putting them together, it will have a lot of reward in the long run. There's plenty of fairly straightforward tutorials on YouTube or other places online. It is very satisfying to be able to just ping the guns on and off and change your knight household around if you want to try out a different loadout with different weapons. Gameplay wise, Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights often tend to be a bit of a power trip. Big and stompy walkers, all of which have scary damage output and heavy weapons coming out of them. Every model in its own right is going to be a fairly big threat. There's not really going to be much that's just relegated to doing grunt work, unlike in some other armies. Generally speaking, it should mean that you have enough raw power to deal with a whole bunch of armies, and they shouldn't be too hard to play. Plus, with knights having only a very few models means that you can really focus on thinking about the decisions for each one of them, think through what might happen if you move a knight in a certain place, and your turns are going to be a bit quicker, which should give you a little bit more chance to think things through properly. In terms of drawbacks for collecting knights, I would bear in mind it's a bit of a different gaming experience to most armies in 40k. By their nature, they're a very skewed army with a whole load of big heavy vehicles. Oftentimes you can find yourself just easily gunned down by armies that excel at taking down that sort of thing. And for your opponents as well, it can often mean that games against them feel a little bit samey, trying to gun down the big stuff. I don't feel like they're necessarily right for everyone, but they can be a fun and different army, and do have their advantages for new players, I think. If I were starting them, then I'd either go for a standard Questorius or the Abominant Desecrator kit if you're Chaos Knights. Probably one of those, and maybe a copy of either the War Dogs or the Armigers kit. They seem like pretty sensible as the first couple of purchases. Might not be the worst idea to start out practicing on an Armiger or War Dog first to work out your colour scheme and how you're applying it, before you go for tackling one of the big boys. Finally, in this little list of factions that might be a bit better for newer players in 40k, we have the Tyranids. I feel like it would be wrong to miss them off as a mention at the moment, given that they're going to be one of the major factions of 10th edition. They've got a whole load of good stuff coming for them, and like the Necrons in 9th, it should mean that there's a lot of ways to acquire their miniatures very cheaply. The Tyranids are the all-consuming swarms from the void, a voracious mass of super predators from beyond the galaxy, making war to devour whole worlds in vast hive fleets, adaptable and specialized war organisms raining down from the skies, and combining raw might with an alien cunning and eldritch horror. They've got both combat options and ranged guns with their biocannons, plus really quite a lot of psychers in the army like these Zoanthropes. Models wise, they haven't had too many updates in a while, a sort of medium-aged 40k army at the moment, though they are set to receive an enormous amount of kits going into 10th. Lots of things recently shown off for the Leviathan box, and they will be receiving a bunch more kits after that. I'm expecting really quite a lot of updates to classic miniatures, and probably a few new surprises. Pricing wise, normally I would have said that Tyranids aren't particularly better or worse than most of the other 40k factions, but as the main antagonist faction of 10th edition, that's pretty much set to change. The 10th edition launch box Leviathan is one of the better deals that Games Workshop have basically ever made, and I think that the Tyranid offering is perhaps arguably the better out of the two sides. 47 bugs, including some big ones, a pretty excellent way to start the faction if you can snag the Tyranid half of that. Otherwise, that should probably be followed up by some starter sets and the Combat Patrol, and I wouldn't be too surprised if we get a magazine type offering similar to Warhammer Conquest or Imperium sometime in 10th. Again, that could be another source of discounted Tyranid miniatures. For getting models on the table, I will admit that Tyranids can perhaps be a bit hoardier than some of the other factions. Depending on which way you play them, you might need to paint up really quite a lot of little bugs, swarms of Tyranids or Hormagaunts to mob the enemy. That being said though, I would rate them as one of the quicker factions to paint, at least on a per model basis. A lot of Tyranid miniatures are kinda simple with the paint scheme, one scheme for the fleshy bits under their carapace, and then one scheme for the hard carapace bits like this Tyrannifex here, And both parts of that are really quite organic as well, so it means that you can use things like washes, dry brushes, or contrast paints to speed up the process. It's not necessarily the hardest to churn out a whole ton of bugs. Gameplay wise, they are quite a flexible range, and they've already got quite a big choice of miniatures, never mind all the new arrivals. You definitely can build for both range and melee, so are somewhat flexible. And at least comparatively, I'd say that they wind up being a fairly typical 40k faction from a gameplay point of view. Not necessarily enormously better or worse than other armies' offerings, at least to a newer player. At least you should be able to find some specialised organisms to fit your playstyle. Finally, as mentioned, I would bear in mind that some builds can be a little bit model heavy. That's definitely one drawback in terms of getting miniatures on the table and also buying them in the first place, though I feel like it's not necessarily going to be a requirement, and I'm sure there'll be builds where you can make some more elite versions work. If you do choose to go hordes though, then they can look pretty striking on the table when you've got loads of ranked up bugs. In terms of starting them, at the time of recording, I'd be quite tempted to pick up that Leviathan box and maybe just keep the Tyranids and sell off the Space Marines if you don't want them, or perhaps split them with a friend. It looks like there's going to be a combat patrol with a bunch of those miniatures following up after that though, if you're watching this in the future, plus likely some 10th edition starter sets too, that will probably have Tyranids versus Space Marines in a different format. In the meantime though, I'd probably stick to some of the most new plastic kits out of the Tyranid range. There's at least a fair few things that might well get replaced as slightly older miniatures. Maybe in particular things that Games Workshop have shown off in their previews tend to be better and a bit more safe. I'd be a little bit apprehensive about picking up resin things like lictors or biovores for example. Obviously besides these 5 there's plenty more decent other factions to start with. Maybe other good mentions will be just about anything else that's in power armor, Chaos Marines, Death Guard, Thousand Sons and Grey Knights, all fairly elite armies that maybe don't need all that much in terms of models and might have better value in terms of putting points on the table for the money. Thousand Sons and Chaos Marines can be a bit painful in painting all that trim, and at least historically Thousand Sons and Grey Knights have both been a little bit more complex than some, needing some psychic shenanigans plus their regular things, but in 10th edition it looks like a lot of complexity is getting toned down for better or worse. Maybe some other small possibilities could be Chaos Demons, as they're generally fairly straightforward to paint, plus you might have an army that you can then use in Age of Sigmar if you take a fancy to. And currently as it goes, a Leagues of Votann army isn't actually too bad in terms of points that you get on the table for money invested. That might just be a reflection of the slightly overtuned rules that they gave them in 9th edition though, might not necessarily translate over to 10th. They are currently a slightly cheaper force to put on the table than some though. In any case, let me know your thoughts. Are you thinking of starting 40k and what factions are tempting you the most right now? Plus any other insights for collecting any of these factions are greatly appreciated. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Otherwise, if you have been enjoying quite a bit or finding these videos useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the thing that allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly for you guys. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.